I was not born free. I was born into silence, into chains, into a world where my name did not belong to me. My first breath was not a celebration. It was an entry into a system designed to break me before I could even understand what freedom meant. My name is Harriet Tubman, but I was not always called that. I came into this world around 1822 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. They called me Araminta Ross, Minty for short, a name spoken softly by those who loved me and shouted harshly by those who believed they owned me. My parents were enslaved too. Strong people, quiet strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but endures. From them, I learned how to survive in a world that had already decided what I was worth. I did not have a childhood the way it should have been. There were no toys, no safety, no room to dream. There was work. By the time I was 5 years old, I was already hired out, too small to carry what they gave me, too young to understand the cruelty behind it, but old enough to feel the pain when I failed. And I failed often, not because I was weak, but because I was human. Punishment came quickly, whippings, hunger, cold nights. But even then, something inside me refused to disappear. There is a moment in my life that changed everything. A single moment that divided my existence into before and after. I was sent to a store one day. An enslaved man had tried to escape, and the overseer demanded help to stop him. I refused. It was a small act, but in that world, it was rebellion. The overseer picked up a heavy iron weight and threw it, not at the man, but at me. It struck my head. Darkness swallowed me whole. I should have died that day, but I didn't. Instead, I carried it with me. The pain never truly left. I would collapse without warning, falling into deep, sudden sleep. Visions would come to me, strange, powerful, overwhelming. Some said it was injury. I believed it was something else. I believed God was speaking, because when everything else is taken from you, you learn to listen for something greater. Slavery teaches fear. It teaches you to shrink yourself, to obey, to survive quietly. But it also teaches you what matters. And what mattered to me was freedom, not just mine, everyone's. I watched my family get torn apart, sisters sold away like objects. One day, they were there. The next, they were gone. No goodbye, no closure, just absence. That kind of loss doesn't fade. It hardens you. It sharpens something inside you. I got married to a free black man named John Tubman. That's where my last name came from. But marriage did not change my condition. I was still enslaved, still owned, still trapped. And then one day, I heard something that sealed my fate. I was going to be sold deeper into the South, where escape would become nearly impossible. In that moment, fear stood in front of me, but so did something else. A decision: stay and disappear, or run and risk everything. I chose to run, not with noise or announcement, just quiet steps into the night. I didn't have a map. I didn't have certainty. What I had was belief. Belief that somewhere beyond the darkness, there was something better. They call it the Underground Railroad now. But it wasn't a railroad. It was people, brave souls who chose to stand against something powerful and cruel. I moved at night, through forests, across rivers, hiding, listening, trusting every instinct I had. Every sound could be danger. Every shadow could betray me. But I kept going, step by step, until one day I crossed into Pennsylvania. I remember looking at my hands. They hadn't changed, but everything else had. I was free, or at least, that's what the world said. But freedom didn't feel complete, because I was alone. My family was still in chains. My people were still suffering. And freedom, without them, didn't feel like freedom at all. I could have stayed there, built a quiet life, disappeared into safety. But that was never going to be enough for me. Because once you've tasted freedom, you cannot ignore those who are still starving for it. So I made another decision, a more dangerous one. I would go back into the very place I had escaped from, not for myself, but for others. I became what they would later call a conductor on the Underground Railroad. But to me, I was just a guide, a protector, a promise. I returned again, and again, and again. Each journey was a risk. Each step carried the weight of death. But I carried something stronger than fear. I carried purpose. I led men, women, children through darkness, through silence, through danger. And I never lost a single passenger, not one, because turning back was never an option. Freedom was forward, always forward. They called me Moses, not because I asked for it, but because I refused to leave my people behind. And even when the war came, the American Civil War, I did not step away. I served as a nurse, a scout, a spy, and even then, I led missions that freed hundreds more, because my fight was never about one moment. It was about a lifetime of resistance, a lifetime of choosing courage when fear would have been easier. I was hunted. There were rewards for my capture, but they never took me, because I moved with something they could not understand: faith, determination, and a refusal to accept the limits placed on my life. I was born into slavery, but I did not die in it. And my story is not just about escape. It is about return. It is about sacrifice. It is about choosing to fight, even when you have every reason not to, because freedom is not given. It is taken, and sometimes it is carried back for others. This is not just history. This is legacy. This is what it means to rise when everything around you demands that you fall. Freedom did not end my journey. If anything, it gave it purpose. Because once you step out of darkness, your eyes begin to adjust, and you start to see just how many are still trapped inside it. I could not unsee it. I could not unknow what I had lived through. And I could not pretend that my freedom was enough while others still whispered prayers in chains. So I went back, not once, not twice, but over and over again. Each time I crossed that invisible line back into slave territory, I understood something clearly. I was walking straight into danger, not the kind you imagine, but the kind that breathes behind your neck, that listens for your footsteps, that waits for you to make one mistake. There were rewards placed on my head, money for my capture, men who would hunt me not because they knew me, but because they wanted what I represented to disappear. But fear had already done everything it could to me. It had starved me, beaten me, tried to silence me, and it failed. So I moved anyway. The nights became my shield, darkness my ally. I learned how to read the land, the trees, the rivers, the sky. I followed the North Star like it was a promise written just for me. Every journey was different. Some nights were quiet, others filled with tension, so thick you could feel it in your chest. I traveled with families, mothers holding babies, fathers trying to stay strong, children too young to understand why they had to walk without making a sound. Sometimes they wanted to turn back. Fear has a way of whispering lies, especially when the path ahead is uncertain. But turning back was not an option. I carried something with me on those journeys, a small pistol, not for violence, but for resolve, because I understood something deeply. If one person turned back, they could betray us all. not out of malice, but out of fear. And fear spreads. So I made it clear. We move forward, or we don't move at all. It was harsh, but slavery was harsher. And freedom required a different kind of strength. There were moments when we came close to being caught. Dogs barking in the distance, voices cutting through the night, footsteps that didn't belong to us. In those moments, time slowed, breath became heavy, and every decision mattered. Where to hide, when to move, who to trust, because not everyone who smiled was safe, and not everyone who whispered help could be believed. But there were good people, quiet people, brave people, homes with hidden rooms, doors that opened without questions, hands that offered food, warmth and silence. They were part of something bigger than themselves. A network of courage, a rebellion made of compassion. And each time we made it through, each time we reached free land, there was a moment I will never forget, when the realization hit them. They were free. Some cried, some fell to their knees, some stood in silence, unable to process what had just happened. Because freedom, after a lifetime of chains, feels unreal at first, like a dream you're afraid to wake up from. People say, I freed hundreds. They count numbers. But I remember faces, voices, stories. Each person carried a lifetime of pain and hope, and I carried them with me. Every step, every journey, every risk. They started calling me Moses. I didn't choose the name, but I understood it, because like the story I had grown up hearing, I was leading people out of bondage, not with miracles, but with persistence, with courage, with a belief that no human being was meant to be owned. Then came war, the American Civil War, a nation tearing itself apart over something that should never have been a question: freedom. I did not stand on the sidelines. I could not. I joined the Union forces, not as a soldier with a uniform and title, but as something just as important, a nurse. I cared for wounded soldiers, many of them sick, broken, forgotten, using herbs and remedies passed down through generations. I did what I could to ease their pain, but healing was only one part of my work. I became a scout, a spy, moving quietly through enemy territory, gathering information that others could not reach, because I knew the land, I knew the patterns, I knew how to disappear when necessary. And then came one of the most defining moments of my life, the Combahee River Raid. I helped plan it, led it, guided Union forces through waters filled with danger, past hidden mines, into Confederate territory. That night, we freed more than 700 enslaved people. 700 men, women, children, all stepping out of bondage into uncertainty, yes, but also into possibility. It was more than a mission. It was proof that the system could be broken, that the chains were not unbreakable. But even after the war ended, even after slavery was officially abolished, the fight did not stop, because freedom on paper is not always freedom in reality. I saw it. The struggle continued, different forms, different faces, but the same injustice. So I kept going. I fought for women's rights. I stood beside voices like Susan B. Anthony, demanding that women, especially Black women, be seen, be heard, be valued, because I knew what it meant to be invisible. And I refused to let that invisibility define the next generation. I opened my home to those who had nowhere to go, the elderly, the poor, the forgotten, because I remembered what it felt like to be left behind. My body grew tired over the years. The pain from my injury never truly left me, but my spirit never surrendered. I did not measure my life in comfort or ease, or recognition. I measured it in impact, in lives changed, in chains broken, in moments where fear was replaced by courage. And when people speak my name now, when they tell my story, I hope they understand something deeper. I was not fearless. I felt fear many times, but I did not let it decide my path. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. I was born into slavery. I walked through darkness. I faced death again and again, but I chose to move forward. And in doing so, I carried others with me. This is not just my story. It is a reminder that no matter how deep the darkness, there is always a way forward. And sometimes that way forward begins with one step into the unknown. Even after the missions, even after the war, even after the world began to change its language about slavery, my life did not become easy. Freedom, for many of us, was not a destination. It was a long road that still had barriers, still had poverty, still had silence in places where justice should have spoken loudly. I lived long enough to see that truth clearly. I had given so much of my strength to others that there were times I had very little left for myself. My body carried the memory of every strike, every collapse, every night without rest. The injury in my head never left me. It followed me through every year like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. There were moments when I would suddenly fall into those same deep spells, the same unconscious states I had known since childhood. Sometimes I would be in conversation, sometimes walking, sometimes simply sitting. And then, without warning, darkness would take me again. But I learned to live with it because I had already survived worse. I never became wealthy. I never became powerful in the way the world often measures power. Instead, I became something quieter, something deeper, a symbol of endurance, a living reminder that even those born into chains can become the force that breaks them. Still, survival after slavery was its own kind of struggle. There were no systems waiting to support people like me, no safety nets, no guarantees, just the continuing work of existing in a world that had not yet decided how to treat people who had once been property. So I did what I had always done. I built. I cared for others. I opened my home as a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. Elderly people, disabled people, those abandoned by families or forgotten by society. I turned suffering into shelter where I could. It was not grand. It was not praised, but it was necessary. In my later years, I began to see something I did not expect. People began to tell my story, not all at once, not fully, but piece by piece. They spoke of the journeys, the rescues, the courage. They called me brave. They called me fearless. But I know the truth. I was afraid many times, afraid of capture, afraid of failure, afraid of losing those I was trying to save. But fear never stopped me, because I understood something that slavery had taught me in the deepest way possible. If you wait for fear to leave, you may never move at all. So I moved with it, through it, beyond it. I watched the world change, slowly. Slavery ended in law, but its echoes remained in the lives of many who had lived through it. Freedom did not erase pain. It did not erase trauma. It did not return stolen years. But it opened a door, and I had spent my life pushing that door wider. There were moments of recognition in my old age. People came to hear me speak, to sit with me, to listen to stories that had once been lived in secrecy, in danger, in silence. I did not tell them to admire me. I told them so they would understand what was possible when a human being refuses to accept the limits placed upon them. Even when my strength faded, my voice still carried. Because truth does not depend on strength. It depends on memory. And I had carried too many memories to stay silent. In the final years of my life, I reflected often, not on fame, not on survival alone, but on meaning. I thought about the faces of those I led through the dark. I thought about the ones who made it to freedom and the ones I could not reach in time. I thought about the nights when I could have turned back, but didn't. And I understood something simple. My life was not mine alone. It belonged to everyone I had carried with me. And if I had to define what I became, it would not be a title, not a legend, not a symbol, but a guide. Someone who walked first so others could follow. Someone who refused to let darkness have the final word. I was born into bondage. I lived through fear. I walked through danger more times than I can count. But I did not stay where I was placed. And because of that, others did not have to stay either. If there is anything I want the world to remember about me, it is this: freedom is not given freely. It is claimed. It is carried. And sometimes it is risked again and again for the sake of others. And long after my voice is gone, long after my name becomes history instead of presence, I hope the message remains that no matter how deep the chains, no matter how long the night, there is always a path forward. And sometimes one person walking that path is enough to change everything that comes after. I am older now, not just in years, but in distance from the life I once knew. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of memory, but it does not erase them. I still carry them. Every step through the swamp, every night under the stars, every heartbeat that felt like it might be my last, they are still with me, just quieter now. There are days when I sit in stillness and think about the girl I once was, Araminta, Minty, a child who did not understand the world she had been placed into, but who still somehow refused to accept it as final. I think about her often because she is the reason I became anything at all. People have asked me what gave me the strength to do what I did, to go back, to risk my life again and again, to lead others through fear that could swallow a person whole. But strength is not something I woke up with one morning. It was something built, pain by pain, loss by loss, choice by choice. I did not have certainty. I did not have safety. I did not have promises that things would work out. What I had was conviction, a deep, unshakable sense that no human being was meant to live and die in chains. And once you believe that fully, you cannot unknow it. There is something I want to say clearly because it is often misunderstood. I was not alone in what I did. History likes to place one name at the center of a story that belonged to many. But I was carried forward by countless unseen people. The conductors, the farmers who hid us, the families who opened their doors, the strangers who risked everything without asking for credit or recognition. Without them, there is no journey. Without them, there is no freedom. I remember one night more clearly than most. We were moving through the dark, tired, hungry, uncertain if we were being followed. A child in the group began to cry, just a small sound. But in that world, even small sounds could become dangerous. I remember holding that child close, pressing a hand over their mouth not out of cruelty, but protection, whispering softly that freedom was close, even when I wasn't sure myself. Because sometimes leadership is not about certainty. It is about presence, about carrying others even when your own fear is heavy. I have been called many things in my life: a runaway, a conductor, a nurse, a spy, a symbol. But I was also just a woman trying to do what felt right in a world that made it difficult to do anything at all. When the war came and slavery began to fall apart, I did not feel celebration immediately. What I felt was exhaustion, because survival changes a person. It teaches you to keep moving even when your body begs you to stop. And when the world finally slowed down, I realized I had forgotten how to rest. But I tried. I tried to build something quieter in the aftermath, a place where people could feel safe, a place where age did not mean abandonment, a place where those who had been broken by time could still be treated with dignity. It was not large, it was not perfect, but it was real. And sometimes that is enough. As I grew older, I began to understand that legacy is not built in moments of applause. It is built in moments no one sees. A decision made in silence, a step taken in fear, a hand extended when it would have been easier to turn away. And I began to see something I had not fully understood before. That freedom is not a single event. It is a continuation, a responsibility that does not end when you cross into safety, because there will always be someone still waiting in the dark. I think about that often. Even now, even here, the world does not stop needing courage. It simply changes where courage is required. If my life has any meaning beyond my own survival, I hope it is this: that one person's refusal to accept oppression can become a path for many others. That even in the darkest systems, resistance is possible, and that no matter how long injustice stands, it is never permanent. I did not change the world alone, but I refuse to let the world remain unchanged in me. And if my story continues beyond this moment, beyond this voice, beyond this telling, let it not be remembered only as escape, but as return for others, return for hope, return again and again, until freedom is no longer rare, but expected, because in the end, I was not just running from something, I was walking toward something greater than fear. And I kept walking so others could too. There comes a point where even memory begins to feel like distance, not because it fades, but because it no longer belongs to the same version of you who lived it. I can still see it all: the night air, the sound of footsteps behind us, the silence we learned to trust more than voices. But I am no longer in those moments. I am only the echo of them. I think often about the meaning of all those journeys, not just the danger, not just the escape, but the reason I kept going back when I could have stayed away. There is a simple truth I came to understand slowly. Freedom is not complete when it is only personal. A person can breathe freely and still hear the cries of those who cannot. And if you are still able to hear them, you are not finished yet. There were nights when I questioned everything, not my faith, not my direction, but my limits. Could one person truly carry so many lives through danger and expect to survive it? Could courage alone be enough? And each time doubt rose, I remembered something deeper than doubt. I remembered what slavery felt like, not just physically, but spiritually. The way it tries to convince you that your life is smaller than it is, that your future has already been written by someone else. That resistance is pointless. And I rejected that idea completely because I had already seen it proven false. Every person I led out of bondage was proof. Every mile we walked in silence was proof. Every sunrise we reached while still alive was proof. People often speak of history as if it is something fixed, as if it is already finished. But I know differently. History is shaped in motion, by decisions made in fear, by choices made in hope, by people who refuse to accept the story they are told they must live inside. I was never interested in being remembered as extraordinary. Extraordinary suggests distance, something separate. But I was not separate. I was human, fully human. A woman who bled, who feared, who collapsed, who doubted, and still chose to continue. And that is what I want to be understood most clearly. Not perfection, not legend, but persistence. There were moments after the war when I would sit quietly and think about all the faces I had seen. Some were lost to time. Some I never saw again after freedom. Some I only knew for a short stretch of road in the dark. But none of them left me. They stayed in my memory, like voices that refused to be silenced. And I began to understand something painful and beautiful, that carrying others is not just an act of strength. It is also an act of burden, because you do not only carry their bodies to safety, you carry their stories forever. There is a weight to that kind of life that never fully disappears. Even when the world calls you free, even when the fighting stops, even when your name is spoken with respect, the memory remains. I did not live to be untouched by suffering. I lived to transform it into movement, into direction, into something that refused to end where it began. And if there is a final truth I can offer from the distance of my life, it is this: oppression is not only maintained by force, it is maintained by silence, by acceptance, by the belief that nothing can change. And every time someone refuses that belief, something shifts, even if only slightly, even if only briefly. I did not end slavery alone. No one person could, but I proved something important in my time, that systems built on injustice are not as permanent as they appear. That fear can be walked through, that darkness can be crossed, that one step leads to another. And when enough people take those steps, the world changes. I do not know how history will continue to speak my name. That is not mine to decide. But I hope that when it is spoken, it carries more than admiration. I hope it carries understanding. That freedom was never a gift I received. It was something I risked again and again for others. And if my life must be reduced to a single idea, let it be this: that no matter how deep the night becomes, a person can still choose to move. And in that movement, everything begins to change. There is not much left to say, but there is something that still matters, because endings are not always silence. Sometimes they are understanding. I have lived long enough to see the weight of my own story settle into the world, to hear it spoken in rooms I will never enter, to see it written in pages I will never turn, to feel it carried by people I will never meet. And yet, I recognize something in all of it, not my greatness, but my humanity. I was not born into freedom. I did not inherit safety. I did not move through life without fear. I lived inside fear and moved anyway. That is the truth of my existence. Not escape alone, but persistence through conditions designed to end persistence. There is a misunderstanding that sometimes follows stories like mine, that courage feels like certainty. It does not. Courage feels like uncertainty that you refuse to obey. It feels like stepping forward when every instinct tells you to disappear. It feels like carrying others while wondering if you will all make it through, and still choosing to continue. I think of the word freedom often. It is used easily now, but I learned it slowly, not as a concept, but as a risk, a journey, a responsibility. Freedom is not just what you gain when chains are removed. It is what you do with the knowledge that others are still bound, and whether you choose to ignore that knowledge or act on it. I acted, again, and again, until acting became the only way I knew how to live. If my life has meaning beyond memory, it is because I refused to let suffering be the final language of my people. I refused to let silence be the ending. I refused to accept that the world must remain as it was handed to me. I was not the only one who resisted. There were many, too many to name, too many to count. People who risked everything without ever being recorded. People who built freedom in places history never looked. They are part of this story too, always. And so, if you remember me, do not only remember motion through darkness. Remember why the motion mattered. Not escape, but return. Return for others. Return for dignity. Return for the idea that a human life is never meant to be owned. I leave no final triumph, no perfect ending, only a truth carried through everything I lived, that even in the deepest systems of control, a person can still choose. And that choice, repeated across time, becomes change. I was born into slavery. I walked through fear. I crossed into freedom, and I returned again and again, so others could too. And if there is anything left after all words fade, let it be this: no darkness is final, no chain is permanent, and no life is meant to remain small inside the limits others set for it. I am no longer walking those roads, but the path remains. And as long as someone chooses to step onto it, the journey continues. And now, as this story reaches you, across time, across pain, across history, there is one thing left that cannot stay silent. Because stories like this are not meant to end as memory. They are meant to become movement. If this journey of Harriet Tubman moved something inside you, if it reminded you that courage is not born in comfort, but in struggle, then don't let that feeling fade into silence. Take it with you. Let it shape how you see strength. Let it reshape how you see freedom. Let it remind you that no chain, physical or mental, was ever meant to be permanent. Because here at JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions, we don't just tell stories. We revive voices the world tried to bury. We turn pain into purpose. We turn history into living fire. And we believe something simple. If one life could rise from chains, then every life carries the possibility to rise from something too. So don't just watch this story. Carry it, share it, let it challenge you, let it change you, and most importantly, let it remind you that your own story is still being written. Because the truth is not only what happened in the past, the truth is what you choose to do next. This is JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions, where stories don't end, they awaken. I was not born into greatness. I was born into a world that would one day demand it. My name is Irena Sendler. And this is not a story of courage as much as it is a story of choice. Because courage suggests fearlessness, but I was afraid every single day. Yet, I chose to act anyway. Before the war, before the darkness swallowed everything, there was my father. He was a doctor, a kind man, a man who believed that no human life was worth more than another, rich or poor, Jew or Catholic. It didn't matter. He treated patients others refused to touch, even when it meant risking his own life. And eventually it did. He died of typhus, a disease he contracted while treating Jewish patients who had been abandoned by others. I was just a girl, but his words, they stayed with me. If you see someone drowning, you must try to save them, even if you cannot swim. I didn't know then that one day I would be standing in an ocean of suffering, surrounded by thousands who were drowning. Then came the war. World War II didn't begin with screams. It began quietly like a storm in the distance. Until it arrived, Warsaw was no longer a city. It became a prison. The Germans invaded. Their boots echoed through our streets. Their orders were swift and merciless. And soon, the Jews were no longer neighbors. They became targets. Families were torn apart. Rights were stripped away. Humanity erased. And then the walls went up. The Warsaw Ghetto, a place designed not just to contain people, but to break them. Hundreds of thousands crammed into suffocating spaces. Starving, diseased, forgotten by the world. Children everywhere. Their eyes were hollow. Their cries constant. They were dying, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they were born. I could not accept it. I would not accept it. I worked as a social worker. It gave me access, a reason to enter the ghetto. Officially, I went in to inspect sanitation. Unofficially, I went in to save lives. At first, I brought food, medicine, clothes, but it was never enough. Nothing was ever enough, because every day, more children died. And that's when I understood something terrifying. Helping them survive inside the ghetto was not enough. To save them, I had to get them out. There is no gentle way to say this. We smuggled children out of hell, sometimes in ambulances hidden under stretchers, sometimes in toolboxes, sometimes through sewers, dark, suffocating tunnels where even breathing felt like betrayal. Babies were sedated so their cries wouldn't give us away. Dogs were trained to bark loudly to mask any sound. Every mission was a gamble with death. If we were caught, it wasn't just execution. It was torture, public, brutal, final. But we kept going, because each child we saved was a universe rescued. Saving them was only half the battle, because one day the war would end, and when it did, these children would need to know who they were, where they came from, who loved them. So I wrote their names down, every single one, their real names and their new identities, and I placed those lists inside glass jars, buried beneath an apple tree, because hope sometimes looks like paper hidden in the dirt. I was not alone. There were others, brave souls who risked everything. Priests, nuns, ordinary citizens who became extraordinary. We forged documents, found safe homes, built a silent resistance. We became ghosts moving through shadows, always watched, always hunted, but never stopping, because stopping meant death. Not for us, for them. And then it happened. They caught me, the Gestapo. They dragged me in like I was nothing. But I was not afraid for myself. I was afraid for the children, for the lists, for the truth buried beneath that tree. They demanded names, addresses, details. I gave them nothing. So they broke my legs, my feet. Pain became my language, but silence remained my weapon. I was sentenced to death. Execution was certain, but fate, or perhaps something greater, intervened. The resistance bribed a guard, and just like that, I was free, officially dead, unofficially still fighting. I returned to the work because there were still children left, and time was running out. When the war ended, there was no celebration for me, only silence and loss. Many of the children I saved had no families left, entire bloodlines erased, but the jars remained. We dug them up, and inside them were identities, memories, connections to a past that had almost been erased forever. Some children found relatives, many did not, but At least they knew. People call me a hero, but I don't see it that way. Heroes are remembered in statues. I remember faces, crying children, mothers handing over their babies, knowing they might never see them again. Do you understand what that means? To give up your child, not because you don't love them, but because you love them enough to let them go, that is courage. Not me, them. For many years, my story was not widely known. History moved on. New wars, new tragedies. But eventually, the world began to listen. They learned about the woman who saved 2,500 children. They called me brave, extraordinary, but I always say the same thing. I could have done more. Chapter 13, the lesson. What does my story mean? It is not about the past. It is about you, right now, because evil does not arrive with a warning. It arrives quietly, in silence, in indifference, and it grows when people do nothing. So the question is not, what would Irena Sendler do? The question is, what will you do? When you see injustice, will you look away or will you act? I was just a woman. No superpowers, no army, no guarantee of survival. Just a choice to stand between darkness and the innocent. And if history has taught us anything, it is this: one person can save a life. One life can change the world. So when the moment comes, and it will come, remember this story, not as a legend, but as a responsibility, because somewhere, right now, someone is waiting for you to be brave. Before the war, before the fear, before I learned how to carry silence like a weapon, I was just a daughter, and everything I became began with him. My father, he was a doctor, but more than that, he was a man who refused to measure human worth. In a world already divided, he chose to cross the line. He treated Jewish patients when others turned them away. He walked into homes filled with disease, knowing the risk, knowing the cost. And one day, the cost came due. Typhus. It took him slowly. I remember the smell of medicine, the quiet in the room, the way adults spoke in whispers, as if silence could bargain with death. But what I remember most were his words. If you see someone drowning, you must try to save them, even if you cannot swim. At the time, it sounded like kindness. Later, I would understand it was a command. Then came the war. World War II did not ask for permission. It did not knock. It arrived, and everything we thought was permanent collapsed. Warsaw changed overnight. Neighbors disappeared. Shops were marked. People stopped making eye contact because to see was to know, and to know was to be responsible. The Germans didn't just take control of the city. They rewrote what it meant to be human. And then they built the walls. The Warsaw Ghetto was not just a location. It was a sentence, a slow, suffocating death stretched across days, months, years. When I first entered, I told myself I was prepared. I was wrong. Nothing prepares you for the sound of hunger. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It lingers in the hollow cheeks of children, in the way mothers hold their babies too tightly, as if grip alone could keep them alive. There were too many people, too little food, too much death, bodies in the streets, not because people didn't care, but because there was no strength left to carry them. And the children, God, the children, they didn't cry the way children should. Their voices were thin, fragile, like they were already halfway gone. That was the moment everything changed, because I realized something I could not unsee. If I walked away, I would be choosing this, and I could not live with that choice. At first, I brought what I could: food, medicine, clothes, small acts against a massive cruelty. But the truth is, kindness inside a cage is still a cage. I began to understand something terrifying. I wasn't saving them. I was prolonging their suffering. And that realization, it broke something inside me because it forced a question I could no longer avoid. What does it really mean to save a life? Saving a child sounds noble. It is not. It is brutal. It is messy. It is filled with moments that will haunt you long after the world calls you a hero. Because to save a child, I had to take them away. There is a moment I will never forget. A mother stood in front of me, her hands trembling, her child clinging to her dress. She knew why I was there. Everyone did. Whispers traveled fast in the ghetto. Hope disguised as danger. She looked at me not as a savior, but as a question. Can you guarantee they will live? I wanted to say yes. I needed to say yes, but I could not lie. So I told her the truth. I cannot guarantee anything, except that if they stay, they will die. Silence. Heavy. Crushing. And then she knelt down, held her child, whispered something I could not hear. Maybe a prayer, maybe a goodbye. And then she placed that child into my arms. Do you understand what that means? That is not trust. That is surrender to the unknown. That is love at its most painful form. We smuggled them out in ways that sound impossible because they were through sewers that stole your breath, inside ambulances hidden beneath sickness and decay, in toolboxes, in sacks, in coffins. Yes, coffins. We taught silence to children who should have been laughing. Babies were sedated, their tiny bodies still, their lives depending on a single breath not being heard. We trained dogs to bark, to cover the sound of life, trying to survive. Every operation was a gamble, every step a risk, every second a prayer. But the hardest part was not the danger, it was the names. Because every child we took had a name, a history, a family. And if we erased that, then even if they lived, something essential would be lost forever. So I wrote them down, carefully, secretly, their real names, their new identities, and I placed those names inside glass jars, buried beneath the earth. Hope hidden like a secret the world was not ready to hear. I was not alone. There were others, ordinary people who refused to remain ordinary. Together, we built something fragile, a network of defiance, forged documents, safe houses, churches that became sanctuaries, homes that became lifelines. We lived in constant fear, but fear became background noise because louder than fear was the knowledge of what would happen if we stopped. And then, one day, it ended. Not the war, but my invisibility. They came without warning. The Gestapo didn't need evidence. Suspicion was enough. They took me, dragged me into a world where pain was not a possibility. It was a promise. Interrogation is too soft a word. They didn't ask. They demanded names, addresses, routes, children. And when I gave them nothing, they took everything they could from my body. They broke my legs, my feet. Pain became constant, sharp, consuming. But pain is temporary. What they wanted was permanent. They wanted me to betray the children, to undo everything, to turn hope into a list of targets. And I refused, not because I was strong, but because I had seen too much to go back. They sentenced me to death. It should have ended there, but resistance has a way of rewriting endings. A guard was bribed, a door opened, and suddenly I was no longer a prisoner. I was a ghost, officially dead, unofficially still fighting. I went back, broken bones, hidden identity, but the work did not stop, because the war had not stopped, and neither had the suffering. When it finally ended, there was no victory, not for me, because survival is not the same as healing. We dug up the jars, carefully, like archaeologists of memory. Inside them were names, thousands of names, each one a thread leading back to a life that had almost been erased. Some children found their families. Many did not. Entire generations gone. But at least they had something, a connection, a truth. People call me a hero. I do not accept that, because I remember the mothers, the fathers, the ones who handed me their children and never saw them again. They were the heroes. I was just the one who walked away with what they could not keep. If you remember me, do not remember me as someone extraordinary. Remember me as someone who was faced with a choice. And understand this: evil does not require monsters. It only requires silence. So when your moment comes, and it will, you will stand where I once stood, between comfort and courage, between safety and sacrifice. And in that moment, you will have to decide, will you look away or will you act? I was afraid every day, but fear is not the opposite of courage. It is the reason courage exists. And if one life can be saved, if one voice can be protected, if one child can be pulled from the darkness, then the risk is worth it. JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions. I was born into a world that had already decided what I was supposed to be. A world that did not ask for my voice. A world that feared it. My name is Ida B. Wells. And before I ever picked up a pen, before I ever wrote a single word that would shake this nation, I was just a black girl born in the aftermath of slavery. Born in Mississippi in 1862 during the fire of the Civil War. They said freedom had come, but freedom did not arrive equally. I did not remember slavery, but I grew up in its shadow. My parents had been enslaved. My earliest memories were not of chains, but of stories about chains. Stories that lived in the silence of my home. Stories that lingered in the eyes of my people. I watched my mother move through life with quiet strength. I watched my father carry dignity like armor. He was a carpenter, a man who believed education was the only true freedom left in this world. And he would say something I never forgot. They can take everything from us, but not what we choose to learn. I did not understand then, but those words were the beginning of everything I would become. I was just a young girl when everything changed. A sickness swept through my home, cholera, and in a matter of days, my world collapsed. My parents were gone, both of them, just like that. No warning, no preparation, no goodbye that felt real enough to hold on to. And suddenly, I was not a child anymore. I became something else, a survivor. I was the eldest of my siblings, and I made a decision that would define my life before I even understood what life was supposed to be. I would not let us be separated, not by poverty, not by grief, not by a system that already expected us to fall apart. So I did the only thing I could do. I became a teacher at 16 years old. I stood in front of classrooms filled with younger children, children who looked at me with trust one was still trying to find in myself. But there was something in me that refused to be small, something that did not understand silence as safety. Education became my survival, but Speaking became my instinct, and that is when I began to notice something terrifying. The world did not simply treat Black people differently. It justified it. Violence was not random. It was organized. Lynching was not hidden. It was public. And worse, it was accepted. There was one moment I can never forget. A story I heard that would not leave me alone. A friend of mine, someone I knew personally, was taken from this world in a way that defied humanity. Lynched. No trial. No justice. No accountability. Just violence disguised as order. And the worst part, the newspapers did not tell the truth. They twisted it. They justified it. They made excuses for murder. And something inside me broke open, not into despair, but into rage that could think clearly, because I understood something in that moment. If they controlled the story, they controlled the truth. And if they controlled the truth, they controlled everything. I began writing, not as a hobby, not as expression, but as resistance. I wrote about injustice. I wrote about lynching. I wrote about the lies printed in newspapers that tried to erase the humanity of Black people. At first, I wrote carefully. Then I wrote boldly. Then I wrote without fear, because fear had already taken too much from my people, and I refused to give it more. The more I wrote, the more dangerous I became, not because I was violent, but because I was honest. Truth, I learned, is not always welcomed, especially when it disrupts power. Threats began. Warnings, whispers, then louder warnings, then something I did not expect. I was told I was no longer safe in the South. My writings had crossed a line. I had exposed what others refused to say out loud. That lynching was not justice. It was terror, and terror depends on silence. I was breaking that silence. I left Memphis under pressure, not because I wanted to, but because staying meant risking everything. My life, my voice, my future. They believed exile would silence me. They believed distance would weaken me. They were wrong. Distance gave me something else. Perspective. I began to understand the scale of what I was fighting. This was not just about one city, not just about one crime. It was a system, a network of fear, built to maintain control. And I had just begun to scratch its surface. When I arrived in New York, everything felt louder, faster, but also more divided. There was freedom here, yes, but also denial. People spoke of progress as if it were complete, as if the horrors of the South were distant echoes instead of ongoing realities. But I had seen too much to stay silent. So I wrote again, and this time, I did not hold back. I published articles that exposed lynching in its rawest truth. I documented cases, names, patterns, the lies used to justify murder. And the backlash came quickly. My name began appearing in hostile newspapers. I was labeled dangerous, unpatriotic, troublemaker. But what struck me most was not the criticism. It was the silence from those who knew I was right, but feared agreeing with me, because truth, when it is inconvenient, becomes a burden people avoid holding. Still, I did not stop, because by now, I understood something deeper than fear. Silence does not protect the innocent. It protects the guilty. What I did not know then was that my writing was not just informing people. It was awakening them. New voices began to rise. Other journalists, activists, women especially, Black women who saw in my work something they had not seen before. Permission to speak. And slowly, something began to form. Not a movement yet, but a shift, a crack in the silence, a question the country could no longer ignore. what is happening in the South? And why is no one stopping it? I thought writing the truth would be enough. I believed that if people simply knew what was happening, they would act. But I learned something darker about the world. People do not always avoid the truth because they don't know it. They avoid it because they do. Am I to be Wells? And this is the moment I stopped being just a writer and became an investigator of America's deepest lie. They said lynching was punishment. They said it was protection. Protection for whom? That was the question I refused to stop asking. Because every story I heard followed the same pattern. A black man accused. No trial. No evidence. A mob. Fire. Rope. Silence. And then the newspapers would arrive after. Not to report the truth, but to justify the ashes. They wrote, necessary. Justice served. Crime prevented. But I began to collect something they did not expect. Facts. I started counting the dead. At first, I did it quietly. One case, then another, then dozens, then hundreds. I read newspapers from different towns, different states, and I noticed something undeniable. The story always changed, but the outcome never did. Black bodies, white mobs, no accountability. So I began documenting everything. Names, dates, locations, circumstances. And when I could not find truth in newspapers, I found it in absence. What they refused to publish became evidence itself. Because silence is also a record. There was a claim I kept encountering, a justification used over and over again. That lynching happens because black men assault white women. It was repeated so often, it became accepted. But I had learned something as a journalist. When a story is repeated too easily, it must be questioned more deeply. So I investigated, and what I found shattered the narrative. In many cases, there was no evidence of the accusation, no trial, no testimony, no proof, just rumor and rage and control. I wrote it plainly. If lynching was truly about justice, why did it require silence, mobs, and fire instead of courts? The moment my findings began to circulate, everything changed. I was no longer just criticized. I was targeted. Newspapers attacked me personally. They called me names meant to discredit my womanhood, my intelligence, my integrity. But worse than that, they began to warn me directly. I was told not to return to the South, not in polite language, in threats, in warnings that carried the weight of certainty, because I had crossed a line. I had turned their truth into a question. My work was expanding now. I was publishing more aggressively, speaking more publicly, organizing more people. And then it happened. My newspaper office in Memphis was attacked, destroyed. The press I used to publish my findings was smashed. My work, years of investigation, was scattered. Some of it burned. They wanted to erase the evidence. But something unexpected happened in that destruction. It proved my point more clearly than any article ever could. They feared the truth more than they feared lies. I left Memphis for safety, but safety was temporary. Every place I went, the same pressure followed. Whispers, warnings, political hostility, because exile was not just physical. It was strategic. They wanted me isolated. They wanted me discredited. They wanted my work to die quietly in the margins of history. But I had already learned something. A voice does not need permission to echo. If America would not listen to itself, then I would make it impossible to ignore. I traveled. I spoke publicly. I met with activists, journalists, and reformers. I carried my reports like evidence in a trial the world had not yet agreed to hold. And I began to understand something powerful. This was not just a Southern problem. It was an American one. And silence was its foundation. They expected me to be afraid. They expected me to soften my words, to retreat, to disappear into the margins. But I was not acting alone anymore. Other women began to rise with me. Black women especially, teachers, writers, mothers, women who had seen too much to pretend otherwise. And together, we formed something that did not exist before. A network of truth-tellers, not loud in numbers, but precise in purpose. My pamphlets spread further than I ever imagined. One in particular, my anti-lynching investigation, reached international attention. People outside America began to ask questions America refused to answer. And that is when I understood. Truth does not need permission to travel. It only needs exposure. And once exposed, it cannot be contained. But truth has a price, and I began paying it in full. My name became dangerous in more places. My safety was never guaranteed. My movements were monitored. My work was challenged, not with debate, but with hostility. Still, I continued, because I had already crossed the point of return. There is a moment in every struggle where fear stops being useful and responsibility takes its place. I began to understand something I had never been taught in school. Power does not rely only on force. It relies on narrative. Whoever controls the story controls the perception of reality. And whoever controls perception controls what people accept as normal. That was the real violence I was fighting, not just the lynching, but the justification of it. As my work spread, I kept returning to one question. If truth alone is not enough to change injustice, then what is? And I would spend the rest of my life trying to answer it. I was no longer just documenting violence. I was confronting the system that made violence acceptable. And the more I revealed, the more I became the thing they feared most. I had spent years collecting the dead, names, dates, cities that tried to forget. But truth, I learned, is not meant to stay on paper. It is meant to move, to gather others, to awaken what silence has buried. Am I to be Wells? And this is the moment I stopped standing alone. At first, I believed my work was journalism. Then I believed it was investigation. But over time, I understood something deeper. I was not just reporting violence. I was standing inside it and refusing to look away. And that refusal began to attract others. Not crowds at first. Individuals, teachers, pastors, women who had buried too many stories in their own homes. People who whispered the same question. Is it really as bad as she says? And I would answer the only way I could. Yes, it is worse. My writings crossed borders now. Not just city lines, not just state lines, but national lines, then international ones. Because what I documented could not be easily dismissed anymore. Too many cases, too many patterns, too many names repeating in different places with the same ending. And something unexpected began to happen. People outside America started asking questions America refused to answer. Journalists in Europe began reprinting my findings. Activists abroad began citing my work. And suddenly, the silence was no longer contained within the country that created it. But visibility does not always mean safety. The more my work spread, the more resistance I faced at home. I was labeled again, radical, dangerous, divisive. They did not argue my facts. They attacked my character, because facts are harder to fight than people. And I became a person they needed to discredit, not because I was wrong, but because I was effective. Something remarkable began to happen. Black women began organizing, quietly at first, then more deliberately. Church groups, educational circles, community meetings. Women who had been told to stay silent about injustice began to speak in their own spaces. And my work became a reference point, not because I asked for it, but because they needed it. I was no longer just writing for the public. I was writing for survival. Out of the growing awareness came something larger, organized resistance. We began calling for public accountability, for legislation, for recognition of what was happening in plain sight. I joined forces with other activists. We spoke in churches, halls, public gatherings. We carried stories that could no longer be ignored. But every step forward came with backlash. Because systems do not surrender quietly, they defend themselves with everything they have. I met politicians who listened politely and did nothing. I met officials who acknowledged privately and denied publicly. I met institutions that claimed neutrality while benefiting from injustice. And I learned something that changed my understanding of power forever. It does not always shout. Sometimes it simply waits for people to stop asking questions. My activism required movement. I traveled constantly, city to city, state to state, speaking when invited, speaking when not invited. I entered spaces where my presence was not welcomed, and still I spoke. Sometimes I saw fear in the eyes of those listening, sometimes anger, sometimes silence, so heavy it felt like resistance itself. But I kept speaking, because silence had already taken too much. Eventually, I was invited abroad, outside America, where the conversation shifted in a way I did not expect. There, I was not dismissed. I was questioned seriously, studied, engaged. My findings were treated as data, not opinion. And I realized something profound. Distance from injustice often makes it easier to see. From outside, what was controversial in America became unacceptable elsewhere. And that contradiction exposed everything. But with visibility came responsibility. I was no longer just Ida B. Wells' journalist. I had become a symbol. For some, hope. For others, threat. For many, both. And I had to learn how to carry that without losing myself. Because symbols can be used, distorted, simplified. And I refused to become a version of myself that fit someone else's comfort. Even as my work grew, one question followed me everywhere. Why does truth require so much effort to be believed? I had documentation, evidence, testimony, but belief was not automatic. It had to be fought for. And that realization changed how I understood the world. Truth does not win by existing. It wins by being accepted. By now, it was clear. I was not alone in this work anymore. A network had formed. Writers, activists, community leaders, women especially, each carrying pieces of the same struggle, each refusing silence in their own way. And together, we were no longer just reacting to injustice. We were challenging its structure. I began as one voice against silence. But silence is not easily broken by one voice alone. It fractures, then spreads, then collapses under the weight of those who refuse to obey it. I used to believe truth was enough to change things. But truth has no power on its own. It must be carried, and carrying it has a cost. Am I to be Wells? And this is the part of my life where the weight became heavier than I ever imagined. By now, My name was no longer just known. It was argued over. In newspapers, in political circles, in private conversations behind closed doors. Some called me brave, others called me dangerous. But what I learned quickly was this: once you become a threat to comfort, you become a target for correction. And correction, in their language, meant silence. At first, they attacked my work, then my reputation, then my character. They said I exaggerated. They said I misunderstood. They said I was emotional, but none of them engaged the evidence, because engaging it would mean admitting it was real, and that was something many were not prepared to do. So instead, they shifted strategy. If they could not disprove me, they would isolate me. Invitations slowed. Support became cautious. Allies became quieter in public. Some who once stood beside me began to distance themselves, not because they disagreed with the truth, but because proximity to truth had consequences. And I began to understand something painful. People do not always abandon truth. Sometimes they abandon the people who carry it. Outside of public struggle, there was private cost. I carried grief, exhaustion, fear that I rarely spoke aloud. There were nights when I wondered how long a person can stand against an entire system before breaking. But every time I considered stopping, I remembered the names, the stories, the silence that followed them. And I knew I could not afford to stop, because stopping would mean accepting it. Progress, I discovered, is not steady. It is uneven, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, sometimes standing still long enough to make you question whether movement ever existed at all. There were moments of hope and moments of deep resistance, moments where I believed change was near, and moments where I saw how far it still had to go. I met leaders who listened carefully, who nodded, who expressed concern. But concern is not commitment, and acknowledgement is not action. I left many rooms understanding this clearly. The difference between hearing truth and acting on truth is courage, and courage is not evenly distributed. There is a hidden burden in being among the first to speak. You are not only fighting injustice, you are also fighting disbelief. And disbelief is heavy, heavier than opposition, because opposition at least acknowledges your presence. Disbelief tries to erase it entirely, but I was not alone. Even when it felt like I was, Black women continued organizing, continued speaking, continued building spaces where truth could survive without permission. Churches became meeting points. Homes became strategy rooms. Conversations became action. And I saw something powerful. Even when public systems resisted change, private networks sustained it. Change did not arrive as a victory. It arrived as persistence, as repetition, as refusal. Each speech I gave, each article published, each conversation continued was not a moment of triumph, but a brick placed in something larger than myself. A structure not yet visible, but forming. Over time, I stopped asking when justice would come, because waiting implied certainty, and I had learned uncertainty was the reality. Instead, I asked something different. How do we continue, even when change is not guaranteed? And I found my answer in action itself. Continuing became the answer. What they never understood. Those who opposed me made a mistake. They believed exhaustion would end resistance, but they misunderstood something fundamental. Truth does not require comfort to survive. It requires only persistence, and persistence does not depend on approval. I was not untouched by the cost, but I was still here, and as long as I remained here, the story was not finished. I did not begin this work expecting legacy. I began it because silence was killing people. But somewhere along the way, silence stopped being the only thing at stake. So did memory. I am Ida B. Wells, and this is the part of the story where I stop speaking for myself alone and begin speaking for what remains after me. I spent years documenting what others tried to erase, names written down so they would not disappear, cases preserved so they could not be rewritten, truth collected like evidence in a trial the world refused to officially hold. And I realized something late in life. You are not remembered because you lived. You are remembered because something you touched refuses to vanish. By the time I saw the broader impact of my work, it was no longer just mine. The ideas had traveled further than I ever could. Anti-lynching campaigns continued. Organizations formed. Writers expanded the record. Activists refined the strategy. And what once began as isolated resistance had become structure, not complete, not victorious, but undeniable. I learned something important about injustice. It does not collapse under one truth. It collapses under repeated truth. Over time, across generations, through many voices, not one. And I understood then that my role was never to finish the work, but to fracture the silence enough for others to continue it. There were things I did not witness in my lifetime. Full equality was not achieved. Justice was not complete. The system I challenged did not disappear, but it was exposed. And exposure is never neutral. Once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And that is where change begins. After I am gone, people will continue speaking about the records I kept, the investigations I conducted, the courage I did not always feel, but chose anyway. And I understand something now that I did not understand while living it. Legacy is not admiration. Legacy is continuation. If there is one question I leave the world with, it is this. What do you do with truth once you know it? Do you bury it again? Do you soften it? Do you delay it? Or do you carry it forward, even when it costs something? Because truth does not ask to be convenient. It asks to be used. I once believed I was documenting injustice, but over time, I realized something deeper. I was documenting refusal to see, refusal to act, refusal to change. And I dedicated my life to interrupting that refusal. Not perfectly, not completely, but persistently. If I could leave one image behind, it would not be of fear. It would not be of violence. It would not be of silence. It would be of a pen, moving across paper, recording what others tried to erase. Because that is where change begins. Not in noise, but in record, in truth made permanent. I was Ida B. Wells. I did not end injustice, but I refused to let it go unrecorded. And in doing so, I made sure it could never pretend it did not exist. Some voices are not meant to be comfortable. They are meant to be remembered.
A voice that would not be silenced. Before the world heard my voice. Before microphones carried my words across continents. Before history placed my name beside the struggle for justice. I was just a child. Born into a country that had already decided my worth. A country where the color of your skin determined your future. Your freedom. Your dignity. South Africa. A beautiful land, divided by something ugly. Apartheid. A system built not just to separate people, but to break them, to silence them, to make them believe they were less. But even in that silence, something stirred. A quiet resistance. A growing fire. A voice, waiting to rise. This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of a people. A nation. A fight between oppression and hope. A story of pain, of courage, of faith that refused to die. I am Desmond Tutu, and this is my story. I was born into a world that did not expect me to speak loudly. On October 7, 1931, my life began quietly, but the world around me was anything but peaceful. South Africa was already tightening its grip on division, not just socially, but legally, systematically, carefully designed to ensure that people like me, Black South Africans, would remain at the bottom. My father was a teacher, a proud man, educated, disciplined. In our home, he was respected. Outside, he was reduced. That contrast stayed with me. It planted questions in my mind. How can a man be respected in one space and disregarded in another? What makes one human being less than another? My mother, gentle and strong, carried dignity in a world that tried to strip it away. She cleaned houses for white families, yet she carried herself with a grace no system could erase. From her, I learned something powerful. That dignity does not come from how the world sees you, but from how you see yourself. As a child, I was often sick. Tuberculosis nearly took my life. I spent long periods in hospital, weak, uncertain. But sometimes, it is in weakness that clarity is born. It was during those moments that I began to observe more deeply, to think, to feel, to understand suffering, not as an idea, but as a reality. And yet, even there, in that fragile state, I encountered kindness. A white priest would visit. He treated me with respect. Not pity. Not distance. Respect. In a country where such behavior was rare, it was revolutionary. He did not preach equality. He lived it. And in doing so, he changed me. I wanted to become a doctor, to heal people, to fix what was broken. But poverty has a way of redirecting dreams. We could not afford medical school, so I chose another path. Teaching. Like my father, I believed education could open doors, expand minds, create possibilities where none seemed to exist. And for a time, I was content, standing in front of a classroom, guiding young minds, believing I was part of something meaningful. But then, reality struck again. The government introduced it was not education. It was indoctrination. A system designed to ensure that black children would never rise beyond a certain level. To teach them obedience, not ambition. Submission, not excellence. It told us, in no uncertain terms, you are not meant for greatness. That, I could not accept. I stood in my classroom and realized something painful. I was not teaching freedom. I was participating in limitation. And so, I made a decision. A difficult one. A necessary one. I walked away. Leaving teaching felt like stepping into the unknown. But sometimes, purpose does not reveal itself until you are willing to let go of what is familiar. I turned to the church. Not because I had all the answers, but because I believed it could be a place of truth. A place where injustice could be challenged. A place where humanity could be restored. I was ordained as a priest in It was not just a spiritual calling. It became a moral one. Because I quickly realized, faith without action is empty. Prayer without justice is incomplete. As I grew within the church, I also grew in awareness. Apartheid was not just affecting individuals. It was destroying communities. Families were torn apart by forced removals. People were relocated like objects, moved from land they had lived on for generations. Cities were reshaped to enforce separation. Humanity was being reorganized by race. And the world still hesitated. I began to speak more boldly. From pulpits, from gatherings, from anywhere I could be heard. Not with anger, but with conviction. Not with violence, but with truth. Some listened. Others did not. But silence was no longer an option. I traveled abroad, studied theology and there I saw something different. A world where people of different races could exist together. It was not perfect, but it was possible. And that realization strengthened my resolve. Because apartheid was not inevitable. It was constructed. And what is constructed can be dismantled. When I returned to South Africa, I returned with clarity. I was no longer just a priest. I had become a voice. A voice that questioned. A voice that challenged. A voice that refused to accept injustice as normal. I rose through the ranks of the church. Not because I sought power, but because influence creates opportunity. And opportunity creates impact. Eventually, I became the Archbishop of one of the highest positions in the Anglican Church in our country. A black man, in a role that once symbolized exclusion. That alone was a statement. But titles do not change systems. Actions do. And the struggle was far from over. The government did not appreciate my voice. I was watched, threatened, labeled. But fear did not silence me. It refined me. Because I understood something deeply. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And so, I chose. I chose to stand, to speak, to resist. This was no longer just my story. It was the story of millions. And the world was about to hear it. There comes a moment in every struggle when speaking the truth stops being symbolic and starts becoming dangerous. I had crossed that line. No longer was I simply a priest offering gentle reflections. I had become a critic of a system built on oppression. And the system was listening. Apartheid was tightening its grip. Protests were rising. Communities were restless. And the government responded the only way it knew how. With force. People were detained without trial. Beaten in the streets. Silenced behind prison walls. Names disappeared. Families waited, sometimes forever. And still, the machinery of apartheid continued. Cold, efficient, unrelenting. I could not pretend not to see it. I could not preach peace without confronting injustice. Because peace, without justice, is an illusion. So I spoke louder. I called for international pressure. Sanctions. Boycotts. Not because I wanted to punish South Africa, but because I wanted to save it. Some said I was betraying my country, but I knew the truth. You cannot betray a system built on injustice. You can only challenge it. I stood before crowds, before cameras, before those who agreed with me and those who did not. And I said what many were afraid to say. This system is evil, not flawed, not misunderstood. Evil. There were moments when violence erupted around me. I remember standing between angry crowds and terrified individuals, trying to prevent bloodshed. Because even in resistance, there is a danger. The danger of becoming what you fight against. I saw young people filled with rage. Understandable rage. But rage, if left unchecked, consumes everything. So I stood there, sometimes physically placing myself in harm's way. And I said, no, not this way. Because our freedom could not be built on the destruction of our humanity. My voice began to travel beyond South Africa, across continents, into rooms of power, into hearts of people who had never seen apartheid, but could feel its injustice. And then, in 1984, the world responded. I was awarded it was an honor, but it was also a responsibility, because awards amplify your voice. But they also increase expectations. Now, I was no longer just speaking to South Africa. I was speaking to the world. I used that platform to push harder, to urge nations to act, to refuse neutrality. Because neutrality, in the face of oppression, is not peace. It is permission. The government did not remain silent. There were threats. Constant. Direct. Subtle. and not so subtle. My life, and the lives of those around me, were at risk. But something within me had settled. Fear would not decide my actions. Because if fear leads, justice dies. At times, I was accused of being too radical. At other times, not radical enough. But I learned something important. If you are committed to truth, you will be misunderstood. And that is a price you must be willing to pay. The resistance movement grew stronger. Leaders like remained imprisoned, but not forgotten. His absence became a symbol, a reminder of what the system feared most. Voices that could not be controlled. Inside South Africa, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Outside, pressure was building. The world could no longer claim ignorance. Sanctions began to take effect. Economically, politically, morally. Apartheid was being cornered. But systems like apartheid do not collapse quietly. They resist. They push back. They try to survive. And in those final moments, they can become even more dangerous. Violence escalated. Townships burned. Lives were lost. And in the middle of it all, there was a fragile hope. A sense that something was shifting. That the impossible might actually happen. Then, in 1990, it did. After 27 years in prison, he walked free. The world watched. South Africa held its breath. And I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel fully before. Relief. Not because the struggle was over, but because a new chapter had begun. I stood alongside him. Not as a hero, but as a witness. To resilience. To endurance. To the power of refusing to be broken. But freedom is complicated. Because removing chains does not automatically heal wounds. And our nation was wounded. Deeply. We had a choice. A dangerous choice. We could seek revenge. Or we could seek reconciliation. Revenge is quick. It satisfies anger. But it destroys the future. Reconciliation is harder. Slower. Painful. But it builds something lasting. I knew which path we had to take. Even if it was unpopular. Even if it was misunderstood. Because true freedom is not just about changing who holds power. It is about changing how power is used. The road ahead would test us. Not just as individuals, but as a nation. And I would soon be called to one of the most difficult roles of my life. A role that would force us to confront our darkest truths. In order to find our light. Freedom arrived. But it did not come quietly. It came with memories. With scars. With stories buried deep beneath years of silence. In 1994, South Africa stood at the edge of something extraordinary. For the first time in our history, every citizen could vote. Not as categories, not as races, but as equals. And when became president, the world celebrated. It was a victory. A moment many thought they would never live to see. But beneath that celebration, there was something else. Pain. Unresolved. Unspoken. Waiting. Because apartheid had not just controlled a nation. It had wounded it. Families had lost loved ones. Communities had been destroyed. Lives had been shaped by fear, by loss, by injustice. And now, we face the question. What do we do with that pain? Ignore it, and risk it festering into resentment? Punish it, and risk creating new cycles of revenge? Or confront it, fully, honestly, painfully? That is when I was asked to lead the. It was not a position of power. It was a position of burden. Because this was not about politics. It was about people. Real people. With real suffering. The goal was simple, and yet impossibly complex. To uncover the truth about what had happened during apartheid. To give victims a voice. To allow perpetrators a chance to confess. And ultimately, to seek reconciliation. We invited people to come forward. To tell their stories. And they did. One by one. Hundreds, then thousands. Voices that had been silenced. finally heard. I sat there, day after day, listening. A mother describing how her son was taken and never returned. A father recounting the moment his family was torn apart. A survivor detailing torture so cruel, it was difficult to comprehend. These were not statistics. They were human lives. Broken. Altered forever. There were moments I could not hold back tears. Moments when the weight of it all became too much. And I would weep, openly. Not as a leader, but as a human being. Because there is no strength in pretending not to feel. True strength is allowing yourself to be moved and still continuing. But then, something unexpected happened. Amid the pain, we began to see something else. Confession. Perpetrators came forward. Some seeking amnesty. Some seeking relief. Some seeking redemption. They told the truth. Not always completely. Not always easily. But they spoke. And then, the unimaginable. Forgiveness. Not in every case. Not perfectly. But often enough to change everything. Victims, choosing not to hate. Choosing not to let their pain define their future. That kind of forgiveness is not weakness. It is power. The kind of power that breaks cycles. I often said, there is no future without forgiveness. And I meant it. Because a nation cannot move forward if it is chained to its past. The commission was not perfect. Some felt justice was not fully served. Some believed forgiveness came too easily. Others believed it was too difficult. But perfection was never the goal. Healing was. And healing is messy. We were not erasing the past. We were acknowledging it, facing it, learning from it. Because only truth can set you free. As the hearings continued, South Africa began to transform. Not overnight. Not completely. But genuinely. We were learning to live together. Not as enemies, but as people with a shared future. I carried every story with me. Every tear. Every voice. They became part of me. A reminder of both the worst and the best of humanity. Because in those rooms, I saw cruelty beyond imagination. But I also saw compassion beyond expectation. And that is the paradox of being human. We are capable of both. The work of the commission eventually came to an end. But the work of healing did not. It continues. Even now. Because reconciliation is not an event. It is a process. A daily choice. And I continue to speak. To remind people that freedom must be protected. That justice must be pursued. That dignity must be upheld. Because the end of apartheid was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new responsibility. A responsibility to build a nation where equality is not just written in law, but lived in reality. And I knew my voice still had a role to play. The world thought the story had reached its triumphant ending. Apartheid had fallen. Freedom had been won. A new South Africa had been born. But I knew something many did not. Victory does not end the struggle. It transforms it. Because injustice has many forms. It can wear different faces, speak different languages, hide behind new systems. And if you are not careful, it can return, quietly, gradually, powerfully. I could have chosen silence. I could have stepped back, accepted the honors, lived comfortably in the legacy of what had already been done. But conscience does not retire. And mine would not rest. Even in a free South Africa, I saw problems emerging. Corruption, inequality, broken promises. The very things we had fought against, threatening to reappear in new forms. And so, I did what I had always done. I spoke. Some were surprised. Others were uncomfortable. Because now, I was no longer speaking against an obvious enemy. I was challenging my own people, my own government, even those I had once stood beside. But integrity is not selective. You cannot demand justice from your enemies. and excuse injustice from your allies. Truth does not change, based on who is in power. I spoke openly about corruption. I challenged leaders to remember why the struggle had been fought in the first place. Not for power, but for people. Not for control, but for dignity. Some said I had become too critical, too outspoken. But I understood something deeply. Silence, in the face of wrongdoing, is betrayal, not just of others, but of yourself. Beyond politics, I also spoke about issues many were afraid to touch. HIV/AIDS was devastating communities across Africa. And yet, stigma kept people silent. Shame kept people hidden. I refused to be silent. I spoke openly. I encouraged compassion, understanding, action. Because illness should never be met with judgment, only care. I also spoke about human rights more broadly. Even when it was uncomfortable. Even when it challenged tradition. Even when it cost me support. Because humanity must always come before approval. I believed in what I often called Ubuntu. A simple idea, but a powerful one. I am because we are. Our humanity is connected. What affects one, affects all. You cannot isolate suffering. You cannot ignore injustice, and expect to remain untouched. This belief guided everything I did. It shaped my voice. It shaped my actions. It shaped my hope. People often asked me how I remained hopeful. After everything I had seen, the cruelty, the violence, the pain, how could I still believe in humanity? The answer was simple. Because I had also seen the opposite. I had seen kindness in unexpected places. I had seen forgiveness in unimaginable circumstances. I had seen people choose love when hatred would have been easier. Hope is not blind. It is informed. It is a decision made in full awareness of reality. As I grew older, my body began to slow. But my spirit did not. Because the work of justice is never finished. It passes from one generation to the next. I began to reflect more. Not on what I had achieved, but on what still needed to be done. Because legacy is not about looking back. It is about what you leave behind, for others to carry forward. If my life had any meaning, it was this. To remind people of their power. Not the power of control, but the power of choice. The choice to speak. When silence is easier. The choice to stand. When sitting feels safer. The choice to love. When hatred feels justified. These are not easy choices, but they are necessary ones. I never claimed to have all the answers. I was not perfect. I struggled. I doubted. I questioned. But I never stopped believing that humanity could be better. And perhaps that is what matters most. Not perfection, but persistence. The willingness to keep trying, to keep speaking, to keep hoping. Because as long as there are people willing to do that, the world can change. And I believed, deeply, that it would. Time has a way of softening the noise of the world, but sharpening its truths. As the years passed, I found myself looking not at the battles we had fought, but at the meaning behind them. What had it all been for? The marches, the tears, the voices raised in defiance. What remained? I came to understand something simple, yet profound. The greatest victory is not the fall of oppression. It is the rise of humanity. I had spent my life speaking to the world. Now, I began speaking more quietly, more reflectively. Not because my voice had weakened, but because my message had deepened. I thought often about forgiveness, not as an idea, but as a lived reality. People misunderstand forgiveness. They think it means forgetting, excusing, moving on as if nothing happened. But that is not forgiveness. Forgiveness remembers. It acknowledges the pain. It recognizes the wrong. And still, chooses freedom over bitterness. Because bitterness is a prison. It locks you in the past. It gives power to what has already hurt you. But forgiveness breaks that cycle. I had seen it happen in the faces of those who chose to let go. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. As I grew older, my body reminded me of its limits. Illness came. Fatigue stayed longer. Moments of quiet became more frequent. But even in that stillness, I felt something powerful. Peace. Not because the world had become perfect, but because I had made peace with my place in it. On December 26, 2021, my journey on this earth came to an end. In the city that had witnessed so much of my life, my voice fell silent. But silence is not the same as absence, because a voice rooted in truth does not disappear. It echoes. The world remembered me in many ways. As an archbishop, as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, as an activist. But I hoped, more than anything, to be remembered as a human being. One who tried. One who cared. One who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. My life was never about standing above others. It was about standing with them. In their pain. In their struggle. In their hope. And now, the story no longer belongs to me. It belongs to you. Because every generation faces its own form of injustice. It may not look like apartheid. It may not wear the same face. But it exists. In inequality. In silence. In the spaces where dignity is denied. And in those moments, a question will always rise. Who will speak? Do not wait for a title. Do not wait for recognition. Do not wait for permission. Your voice is enough. The world does not need perfect people. It needs willing ones. People who are ready to stand, even when it is uncomfortable. To speak, even when it is risky. To love, even when it is difficult. Because love is not weakness. It is the strongest force we have. Stronger than hatred. Stronger than fear. Stronger than any system built to divide us. If there is one thing I leave behind, let it be this. Never underestimate the power of your humanity. You have the ability to change lives, to challenge injustice, to bring light into dark places. Not because you are extraordinary, but because you are human. And that is more than enough. Final outro, powerful call to action. This is not the end of the story. It never was. Because the story of justice, of courage, of hope, is still being written. Right now, in this moment. Somewhere, a voice is needed. Somewhere, a stand must be taken. Somewhere, a choice must be made. Will you be silent? Or will you speak? Will you look away? Or will you stand? Because history does not remember comfort. It remembers courage. And the world is waiting. JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions. Stories that awaken the world and challenge it to change. Frederick Douglass. From chains to a voice that shook a nation. I was born into silence. But silence was never meant to hold me. No name. No birthday. No freedom. Only chains, and the sound of control. But something dangerous happened. I learned to read. And in that moment, they said I became a threat. They tried to break me. Until I made a choice. I would not be broken. I ran. Disguised. Hunted. One mistake, and I would be returned to hell. And then, I was free. But freedom was not the end. It was the beginning of war. I spoke to presidents, shook nations, and gave voice to the forgotten. I was born in chains, but I did not die in them. Frederick Douglass. From chains to a voice that shook a nation. I was born into silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that comforts a child at night. No. I was born into a silence that erased names, that swallowed identities, that buried truth before it could even breathe. I did not know my birthday. I did not know my father. And my mother. She was a shadow that visited in the dark, walking miles under the thread of a whip, just to hold me for a few stolen moments before dawn. By morning, she was gone again. That was my beginning. A child born in chains, in Talbot County, Maryland, where human beings were measured not by their souls, but by their price. I remember the sound before I understood the meaning. The crack of the whip. The scream that followed. The silence that came after. That silence. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I saw my aunt stripped and beaten until her blood stained the ground. I watched men and women reduced to trembling bodies, their cries swallowed by a system designed to pretend they were not human. And I was just a boy, watching, learning, becoming. Slavery does not begin with chains. It begins with theft. The theft of your name, your family, your language, your worth. They took my mother from me before I could even know her love. They made sure I would grow up understanding one thing. I belonged to someone else. But something inside me refused to accept that. I did not yet have the words for it. But I had the feeling. A quiet rebellion. A question that refused to die. Why? When I was sent to Baltimore, my life began to change in ways no one could have predicted. It started with kindness. A dangerous thing, kindness. The woman of the house, Sophia Auld, looked at me not as property, but as a child. She smiled. She spoke gently. And then, she did the unthinkable. She began to teach me the alphabet. A, B, C, simple letters. But to me, they were keys. Keys to a door I didn't even know existed. Every letter I learned felt like breathing for the first time. Every word, a step closer to something I could not yet see. But somehow, I knew it was freedom. And then, it stopped. Her husband, Hugh Auld, found out. His reaction was not anger. It was fear. Teaching him to read, he said, would make him unfit to be a slave. That was the moment. The moment everything changed. Because in his warning, he revealed the truth. Education was not just knowledge. It was power. And if knowledge could destroy slavery, then I would learn, no matter the cost. From that day forward, I became my own teacher. I traded bread for lessons with poor white boys in the street. I studied discarded newspapers. I traced letters on walls, on fences, on the ground beneath my feet. Every stolen lesson was an act of rebellion. Every word I learned was a chain breaking in my mind. But knowledge is a double-edged sword, because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. I began to understand the full horror of what surrounded me. Slavery was not just cruelty. It was a system. A system designed to strip away humanity, to convince the enslaved that they were nothing, and to convince the enslavers that they were right. And the more I learned, the more I suffered. There were days I wished I had never learned to read. Days I envied the ignorance of those who did not yet see their chains. Because knowledge gave me awareness, but not yet freedom. I read about liberty. I read about human rights. I read words like freedom, justice, equality. Words that felt like sunlight. In a world that had only ever shown me darkness. And I realized something that would never leave me. Slavery was not just physical bondage. It was psychological warfare. But if slavery lived in the mind, then that is where the fight had to begin. As I grew older, my body became stronger. But so did the brutality around me. I was sent away to a man known for breaking slaves. A man whose purpose was simple: to destroy the will. His name was Edward Covey. And under him, I nearly disappeared. The beatings were relentless. The exhaustion, unbearable. The humiliation, constant. Day after day, I was pushed beyond my limits. Not just physically, but mentally. He wanted me to forget who I was, to accept that I was nothing, to surrender. And for a time, I did. There is a moment, a terrifying, quiet moment, when a man begins to lose himself, when the fire inside him flickers and threatens to go out. I felt that moment. I lived in it. But something inside me refused to die. Something small, but unbreakable. One day, everything changed. He tried to beat me again. But this time, I fought back. Not out of strength, not out of confidence, but out of desperation. We struggled. For hours. Two bodies locked in a battle that was about more than pain. It was about identity. And in that moment, I remembered who I was. I was not property. I was not an animal. I was not his. And when it was over, something had shifted. He never beat me again. I was still enslaved. But I was no longer broken. That fight was the turning point of my life. Because from that day forward, I made a decision. I would be free, or I would die trying. This is not just a story about slavery. It is a story about awakening, about resistance, about the moment a man decides that his soul is worth more than his survival. And my journey was only just beginning. I had made my decision. Freedom or death. There was no longer a middle ground. After my fight with Edward Covey, something inside me changed forever. The fear that once lived in my bones began to loosen its grip. I was still enslaved, still owned, still hunted by a system that had perfected control. But I was no longer willing to belong. Hope is a dangerous thing for a man in chains, because once it takes root, it refuses to die. I began to study more than words. I studied escape, the movement of ships, the behavior of overseers, the patterns of opportunity hidden in plain sight. Every glance became calculation, every silence, strategy. Baltimore returned to me like a second chance. Back in Baltimore, I blended into the rhythm of the city. A place where slavery still existed, but where cracks in the system were easier to find. There, among free black sailors, dock workers, and laborers, I saw something that stirred my spirit. Black men, walking freely, speaking freely, existing without permission. It was no longer a dream. Freedom was real, and I could reach it. But dreams without action are just another form of captivity. So I made a plan. It was not my first attempt. I had tried before, and failed. The punishment for that failure nearly cost me everything. Chains. Surveillance. A deeper watch placed upon my every move. Failure teaches you something success never can. It teaches you what not to do. So this time, I would not fail. I disguised myself as a sailor, a free man of the sea. I wore clothing that did not belong to me, and carried identification papers that were not mine. Every step I took toward that train felt like stepping closer to the edge of life itself. If I were caught, there would be no second chance, no mercy, only a return to bondage, or something far worse. My heart pounded like a drum against my ribs. Every face looked suspicious. Every voice, a potential threat. Every moment stretched into eternity. But I kept moving. Train to ferry. Ferry to train. Train again. Each transition a test. Each second a risk. I said little. I looked confident. Because sometimes, survival depends on performance. And then, I crossed the line. The invisible line between slavery and freedom. I arrived in New York City. Alone. Exhausted. Terrified. Free. Freedom was not what I expected. There was no celebration. No grand moment. No voice from the heavens declaring my arrival. just uncertainty. Because freedom without safety is just another kind of fear. I was still a fugitive, still hunted, still a man with a price on his head. In the North, slavery wore a different mask. It was quieter, but it was still there. In the suspicion, in the discrimination, in the constant reminder that I did not truly belong. But I was no longer property. And that changed everything. It was during this fragile time that I met her, Anna Murray Douglass. She was a free black woman, strong, steady, unshaken by the world around her. Where I carried urgency, she carried grounding. She had helped me escape, risked everything for my freedom. And now, she would become my partner in life. We married, quietly, without fanfare, because even love had to move carefully in a world like ours. Together, we built something fragile but powerful. A life. We settled in New Bedford, a city alive with abolitionist energy. There I found work. Hard, honest labor. And for the first time, I was paid for it. Do you understand what that means? To work and keep what you earn. It sounds simple. But to a man who had spent his entire life being used for another's gain, it felt like reclaiming a piece of his soul. Yet even in freedom, I could not forget the faces I left behind, the voices still silenced, the chains still clamped around the bodies of millions. Freedom for me was not enough. I attended meetings, listened to speeches, watched men stand on platforms and speak about slavery as if it were an idea, not a lived reality. And then one day, everything changed. I was invited to speak. Just a few words, they said. Share your story. I hesitated, because telling the truth is a dangerous act. But I stepped forward, and I spoke. Not as a scholar, not as a politician, but as a man who had lived it. I spoke of the whip, the hunger, the stolen childhood, the fight for dignity. And the room fell silent. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of realization. They were not just hearing words. They were confronting truth. That day, I found my voice. And once a voice like mine is heard, it cannot be silenced. I caught the attention of William Lloyd Garrison, a powerful voice in the anti-slavery movement. He saw something in me, not just a survivor, but a messenger. I began traveling, speaking, sharing my story across towns and cities. But there was a problem. People didn't believe me, not because my story lacked truth, but because I did not match their expectations. How could a former slave speak like this? They asked. How could he think like this? Their disbelief revealed something deeper. Slavery had not only enslaved bodies, it had enslaved imagination. So I decided to do something bold, something dangerous. I would write my story, not just speak it, not just perform it, but put it into words that could travel farther than my voice ever could. Words that could not be interrupted, denied, or ignored. In 1845 I published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was raw, honest, unforgiving. I named names, described places, exposed the system for what it truly was, and the world could no longer pretend. The book spread like wildfire, across states, across oceans. But with visibility came danger, because now I was no longer just a fugitive. I was a target. Slave catchers had my story, my identity, my location. Freedom had made me visible, and visibility made me vulnerable. So once again, I had to run. This time, not away from slavery, but towards survival. My journey would take me across the ocean, to United Kingdom, a new land, a new audience, a new chapter, but the same mission, to expose, to awaken, to fight. Because my story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every man, woman, and child still in chains. And I would not stop. Not now. Not ever. Running had become a rhythm in my life. But this time, I was not running in fear. I was moving with purpose. Across the Atlantic, to United Kingdom, a land I had never seen. Yet one that would, for a time, feel more like home than the country of my birth. When I arrived, something felt different. Not perfect. Not equal. But different. I walked the streets as a man. Not as property. I spoke. And people listened. Not with suspicion. But with respect. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it meant to be seen as fully human. And yet, even in that freedom, my heart remained restless. Because I knew my people were still in chains. I traveled through cities and towns, speaking to crowds that had never witnessed slavery firsthand. I told them what I had seen, what I had endured, the truth, unfiltered, unapologetic. And the reaction was powerful. Men and women wept. Others burned with anger. Many asked the same question. How can this exist? But I knew the answer. Because I had lived it. Slavery exists when silence is more comfortable than truth. My story crossed borders. And with it, so did the pressure on United States. Supporters rallied around me. Not just with words, but with action. They did something that revealed the deep contradiction of the world we lived in. They raised money to purchase my freedom. Let that truth settle. A man escaped slavery, only to have his freedom legally bought. It was unjust. It was ironic. But it was necessary. And so, I became, in the eyes of the law, a free man. Not just in spirit, but in status. No longer a fugitive. No longer hunted. But still, not finished. Because freedom is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of responsibility. I returned to America with something more powerful than ever before. Legitimacy. Now, I could fight without running, speak without hiding, build without fear of being dragged back into chains. But I did not return to be comfortable. I returned to confront. America was a nation divided, a country that spoke of liberty, while practicing oppression, a land that declared, all men are created equal, while denying that truth to millions. And I refused to let that contradiction stand unchallenged. So I created something of my own. A platform. A voice that could not be controlled by others. A newspaper. The North Star. Named after the guiding light that led enslaved people to freedom. Its message was simple. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Through its pages, I spoke not just to abolitionists, but to the nation. I wrote about slavery, about injustice, about hypocrisy, but I also wrote about something deeper. Human dignity. Because the fight was not just about ending slavery. It was about redefining humanity. And my voice grew louder. But as I rose, so did opposition. Not everyone agreed with my methods. Not even those who claimed to fight the same battle. My relationship with William Lloyd Garrison began to change. He believed in moral persuasion, in changing hearts slowly. But I had lived too much, seen too much, to wait. I believed in action, in urgency, in demanding change, not requesting it. Because when you have felt the lash of a whip, patience becomes a luxury you cannot afford. And so, I stepped into my own path. Independent, uncompromising, unafraid. But my fight did not stop with slavery. I began to see the wider web of injustice. The ways oppression took different forms, yet shared the same roots. One of those battles was the fight for women's rights. In 1848, I stood among voices that would change history. At the Seneca Falls Convention. There, I witnessed something powerful. Women demanding what had long been denied. Equality, voice, recognition. And I stood with them. Because I understood something many did not. You cannot fight for freedom and choose who deserves it. Freedom must be complete, or it is not freedom at all. My life had become a constant movement. Speaking, writing, organizing, challenging. But with every word I spoke, I felt the weight of those who could not. The enslaved, the silenced, the forgotten. Their stories lived in me, and I carried them into every room, every stage, every page. But the storm was coming. Tensions in America were rising. The divide between North and South growing deeper. Slavery was no longer just a moral issue. It was becoming a national crisis. A breaking point. War was approaching. And I knew, when that moment came, my voice would be needed more than ever. Because this was no longer just a fight for freedom. It was a fight for the soul of a nation. The air in America changed before the war even began. You could feel it. In the tension between voices. In the silence between arguments. In the way people stopped pretending everything was fine. A nation divided does not always explode immediately. Sometimes, it cracks first. Slowly. Quietly. Unstoppably. I had seen that crack growing for years. And now, it was breaking open. The country was heading toward what would become the American Civil War. A war not just over land, but over human beings. Over whether freedom was universal or selective. I was no longer just observing history. I was inside it. And I knew something others refused to accept. If this war was fought without the voices of the enslaved, then it would not end slavery. It would only rename it. So I spoke. Again and again. I demanded something radical for the time. That black men should be allowed to fight. Not as property. Not as laborers. But as soldiers. As men. Because I understood something simple. But powerful. If you are good enough to die for a country, you are good enough to be free in it. The war began. And everything changed. In United States, chaos became routine. Families divided. Cities shaken. Blood spilled across fields that once grew food. Now growing loss. But in that chaos, something new emerged. Black soldiers. Men who had once been enslaved. Now holding rifles. Now wearing uniforms. Now standing in formation. Fighting not just for a nation, but for their own humanity. And I felt it deeply. Because every soldier who stepped forward was answering a question the world had asked for centuries. Are we human? And they answered with action. I met with leaders. I spoke directly to power, including Abraham Lincoln. He was a man shaped by contradiction. Hesitant. Careful. Strategic. But history forces even the cautious to choose sides. I told him what he needed to hear. That the war would not be won with silence about slavery. That victory without justice was not victory at all. He listened. Not always immediately. Not always fully. But he listened. And slowly, the world shifted. The war evolved. What began as a conflict over union became a conflict over freedom itself. And then came the turning point. The announcement. The words that would echo through generations. The end of slavery was being declared. But I did not celebrate. Not yet. Because I had lived long enough to know. Words on paper do not always become reality in life. Chains are not broken by declarations alone. They are broken by enforcement. By resistance. By truth made visible. And I had seen too much suffering to believe the fight was over. So I continued. I visited recruitment centers. I encouraged black men to enlist. I spoke at rallies. I wrote articles. I pushed the nation forward even when it resisted. Because freedom delayed is freedom denied. And still, even as the war neared its end, something in me remained unsettled. What happens after war? That question haunted me. Because wars can end systems, but they do not automatically build justice. And I knew America too well. It had a history of promises, and a habit of forgetting them. The war ended. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was legally abolished. But a deeper war had just begun. The war over meaning. What does freedom look like? For those who were once enslaved. What does equality mean? In a nation still shaped by prejudice? What does citizenship mean? When society refuses to recognize you as fully human? These were the questions I carried forward. I stood among ruins of a divided nation, and spoke words many did not want to hear. The fight is not over, because ending slavery was not the destination. It was the beginning of reconstruction, of rebuilding not just laws, but minds. And I knew then, my voice would still be needed, not as a fugitive, not as a runaway, not even just as an abolitionist, but as a witness to truth, to change, to unfinished justice. The war had ended, but my story had not even close. The war had ended, but peace had not arrived with it. In United States, the smoke of battle cleared slowly, revealing a nation still deeply divided, not by armies anymore, but by belief. I had once believed that the end of slavery would bring clarity, but instead, it revealed something more complicated. Freedom is not a single moment. It is a struggle that continues after the applause ends. This period became known as Reconstruction, a word that sounded hopeful, but felt fragile. I walked through a country trying to rebuild itself, while still unsure what it wanted to become. New laws were written. Old systems collapsed. But in the spaces between change, resistance grew. The chains were gone, but their echoes remained. I saw it in the laws that tried to restrict newly freed people, in the violence that followed freedom like a shadow, in the hesitation of a nation that had freed bodies, but not yet minds. And I understood something deeply. Slavery does not disappear overnight. It transforms. So I continued to speak, to write, to warn, because silence, at this stage of history, would have been betrayal. I was no longer simply telling my story. I was defending its meaning. I held positions in government. I served in roles that once would have been unimaginable for a man born into slavery. I became a public voice in the very system that once denied my existence. But I never forgot where I came from. Never. Every handshake I made carried the memory of chains. Every speech I gave carried the weight of those who never escaped. I thought often about identity, who I was before the world gave me a name, and who I became after I claimed it. I was no longer property, no longer fugitive, no longer silent. I was Frederick Douglass, a man who had turned survival into testimony. And yet, there was always more to fight for. Voting rights, equal protection, true citizenship. Because freedom without power is still incomplete. I spoke tirelessly about the importance of the ballot, because I understood something simple. If you cannot choose your leaders, you are still not fully free. I stood with movements that demanded justice beyond abolition, because I knew the struggle did not end with the fall of slavery. It only changed shape. I met presidents, influenced policies, challenged systems, including continued engagement with leaders like Abraham Lincoln earlier in my journey, and later administrations who would shape the fragile future of a divided nation. But no matter how far I traveled, I never left the people behind. I carried them with me. Always. The enslaved who never saw freedom. The voices never recorded in history. The names lost to time. They were not forgotten. Not by me. As I grew older, I began to reflect more deeply on life itself. Not just struggle, but meaning. What does it mean to be free? In a world still learning how to recognize freedom? What does it mean to win a battle that changes everything, yet fixes nothing completely? These questions stayed with me until the end. I had once been a child with no name, no birthday, no future. And yet, I became a voice that crossed oceans. A voice that spoke into power. A voice that refused to disappear. But I was never the story alone. I was only one chapter in a much larger struggle. A struggle still continuing long after my time. In my final years, I often thought about legacy. Not monuments. Not titles. Not recognition. But impact. Did my voice help someone believe they were human? Did my words help bend the arc of justice forward? Did I make silence harder for oppression to survive in? If the answer was yes, then I had done enough. On February 20th, 1895, my journey ended. But not my influence. Because ideas do not die with the body that carried them. They continue. In movements. In voices. In generations yet to come. I was born into chains. But I did not end in them. I lived long enough to see change begin. And I spoke long enough to help it grow. And if there is one truth I leave behind, it is this. Freedom is not given. It is claimed, defended, and never surrendered. This is not just my story. It is the story of every voice once silenced, now refusing to disappear. JANICEFBAPS Studios Productions, where history speaks and silence ends.